Okay, so my name is Herbert Bos. I'm from the VUSEC System Security Research Group in Amsterdam. And when I submitted my biographical information to this conference, the organizers decided to cut off part of it. And since I'm an academic, I will not be silent. So let me now share this with you. Herbert is no fan of COVID or climate change skeptics, but is a great fan of the Beatles. So I think this is all very interesting and you should all hear about this. So with this, I would like to start. Your threat model is bad and you should feel bad are the exact words that were used by a Google engineer in response to a report that we made about a vulnerability in Android, which allowed attackers to bypass two-factor authentication. But I don't want to talk about the vulnerability. I want to talk about what the Google engineer said, that we should feel bad because our threat model was bad. And many people on the internet disagreed. For instance, here's a colleague of ours that said, dude, seriously. And they thought that the threat model was right, and maybe the Google engineer should feel bad. And it turned out indeed that the Google engineer was wrong on this one. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about these threat models because they got me thinking, right? So it actually is an extremely important thing to come up with the right threat model. And it's also harder than you think. So a threat model defines what an attacker tries to accomplish and what the attacker is able to do, so the capabilities, and therefore what you should defend against and what you should not defend against. And we frequently get this wrong. We make our threat models too limited because we make assumptions about the attackers, and the attacker, turns out to not agree with your assumptions. For instance, we may say that, assume that the attacker will never do any of the things that you see here on the slide, right? Break randomization. Or in fact, your phone, once the attacker has infected your PC, which is exactly the issue that the Google engineer commented on, or any of the other things. Or conversely, we may assume that attackers will always have to do certain things, right? So to get the attacker's functionality to execute on your machine, the attacker has to inject code or at least change the flow of control in the software, or any of the other things that we see here on the slide. And it turns out that the attacker doesn't care about your assumptions and does something completely different. So let's talk about threat models and how to get them, right, or how to get them wrong. And most of these slides will contain these hilarious stick figures that you also saw in Michelle's presentation. But every once in a while, there's something interesting on the slides. But fortunately for you, I've explicitly indicated this with this symbol. So keep your eye out for the symbol, and you can forget about all the other slides. So let's talk about threat models and you. So for thousands of years, we humans have tried to make sense of our really complex world by means of two things. We try to classify things and we try to separate concerns. And by classification, I mean that we distinguish between different things. There's me and there's you. There's dark and there's light. There is, I don't know, person, woman, man, camera, TV, and they're all different. So that in ancient Greece, maybe some quarrelsome youth would happen along and say it's all just a lot of the same stuff. Aristotle would step in and say, no, it's actually all a lot of different stuff. We have plants and we have animals, and the plants consist of small plants, medium plants, and large plants, and the animals consist of animals with red blood and animals with white blood, and the red-blooded ones consist of live birth and egg-laying animals, and they're all different. And the recalcitrant youth would say, oh, because as you know, there's nothing to set straight a quarrelsome youth like undiluted science and truth. So this classification is, the first taxonomy, and this became a scientific method, and we still apply this today. So nowadays, we separate things such as the different kinds of attacks that we have. We have software exploitation and we have hardware attacks. And the software exploitation, if we're talking about memory errors, we may consider spatial memory errors and temporal memory errors. And the hardware attacks may consist of speculative execution attacks and rowhammer vulnerabilities in your memory chips, and so on. Okay, and that's really useful because now we can focus on a particular sub branch of a tree. right? We can worry about the spatial memory attacks and try to solve the spatial memory attacks without having to worry about all the other stuff that is around it. Okay, or we can focus on our speculative execution attack and not worry about the spatial memory errors too much. Okay? And that makes it much more productive for us. We can actually make real progress. So this separation of concerns is again something that we've been doing for thousands of years, and it's perhaps best illustrated in the Divine Comedy by Dante, where he's distinguished between 9 layers of hell. Now, 9 layers of hell is really complicated, so this was later simplified to the 7-layer OC reference model, where in the 4th layer of hell, also known as the transport layer, the sinners would be forced to push really big boulders to and from the center and do really hard work. So they could focus solely on that particular task without having to worry about what was going on in the hell below them or the hell above them. And in fact, they could offer this boulder pushing as a service to the ring of hell above them. And that's really good because that was complex and difficult enough. Now, these abstractions, these layered abstractions, and this way of partitioning is all very fundamental to the way we understand the world. We need them to understand the world because otherwise there's simply too much stuff. But as I was sitting down with one of our PhD students, Herbert Bos, he observed that it's actually when these layers, these abstractions break down, that we get the vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities are the cracks in the abstraction. And I think this is, by the way, an important observation. It's exactly that this notion of abstraction doesn't work. And we can see this even in our, 4th layer of hell, the transport layer, where, these guys are really pushing these heavy boulders around in, incredible heat, and while being whipped by demons. It's hard work. So what they might do is, put on some music, listen to K-pop, makes it much easier to do your boulder pushing. But then, of course, you get the neighbors to complain because they don't like K-pop and they say to turn it down. So what you find is that what you thought was confined to your one layer, your transport layer, actually affects adversely all the other layers and maybe causes serious disturbances. Now, this is exactly what is happening also elsewhere. If we look at, for instance, cache side channels, we see the exact same problem. So let's imagine we have 2 programs running to here and here, running on the kernel of an operating system. Okay, and this one is doing something really sensitive, maybe doing some encryption or decryption, or maybe the kernel is doing some sensitive operations. And here there is a malicious program who wants to have access to that secret information. Now, what we are doing is we're trying to separate these concerns, and we do this by assuming that the boundary between the kernel and the user programs is impenetrable. Okay, and the boundary between 2 programs is also impenetrable. There's memory protection there to make it impossible to read anything from the other program. Okay, but in reality, there are many things in the lower layers of hell that are shared. For instance, your cache, which is really fast, small but very fast memory that is always used. So whenever this program or that program uses some data or some executes some code, it will always first be loaded in this really fast memory because then it can be accessed much more quickly. But this cache is shared. So let's assume that this program here is doing something super sensitive, for instance, encryption or decryption. And to do encryption or decryption, what you typically do is you go over every bit in a very security sensitive key. And if the bit is 0, you do something. And if the bit is 1, you do something else. You do something red or you do something blue. Okay, so if this is happening and there is an attacker in the other program, what will happen is that, maybe we're doing encryption and we find that the first bit is a 0. So we do something else. And that means that the code that corresponds to do something, will be loaded at this location in a cache. So there's a fixed location in which you can have your code in the cache. And if the next bit is a 1, the blue part to do something else will be at another location in the cache. But now the attacker is also running code, and that is green. Okay, so and the green part is also using the cache. And in fact, the attacker is accessing many things in the cache, so it tramples all over the red and the blue, and that means that the red and the blue will be thrown out of the cache. Now the green is in their place. Okay, so what the attacker will do is constantly keep accessing this green parts here and measuring the time. Okay, and it keeps doing that, keeps doing that until, say, this process does an encryption or decryption again, which go through this same procedure. And now let's say that the first bit of the key turned out to be, I don't know, a 1, right? So it will do something else first. Well, that means that this process starts accessing something else, and that something else will be stored in the cache at that location. And what that means is that the attacker can now see that when he accesses or she accesses her entries in the cache, right, her memory, some of them will be very fast because they were already in the cache in this fast memory. But then it comes to the next one and it turns out, hey, there's a blue thing there. So that means that it's no longer in the cache, the green part, and we have to get it all the way from slow memory. Okay, so this will be very slow. And that means that the attacker has now learned that the first bit in the secret key was a 1. Okay, now maybe the next time it's a 0. So then he finds this one being slow and so on. So you're learning the secret because there are these shared resources. Now this is a problem, because what I would consider the first law of software engineering is that we don't want to worry about all of these complex things behind abstractions. We use APIs to access these complicated things, okay? And we hide everything behind that, and then we can focus on the task at hand, as what we that's what we saw earlier. Okay. Now this has changed, because all of a sudden it turns out that we do have to worry about how our code interacts with this cache, and that's really complicated low-level stuff. But maybe not just that, we also have to worry about, the memory chips, which may be vulnerable to the row hammer bug. And maybe we have to worry about all of these speculative execution attacks, such as Spectre, Meltdown, Riddle, Foreshadow, and so on. And we have to worry about the operating system functionality, which might try to optimize memory usage by means of memory deduplication. Well, it turns out that you can use that to leak information also. And we have to worry about traditional memory errors, such as buffer overflows also. And we have to worry about, hardware attacks, especially in the IoT. We may have, attackers that, point lasers at our device, or, do some stuff with the power measurements, all sorts of things that are really complicated, and that our developer, this poor developer here, had never even thought about. And that's not his task. The developer, all he wanted to do was build a really cool blockchain application. And now he has to worry about all of these things. What we're doing, I would argue, in security research is to try and reestablish these boundaries between the blockchain developer and all the other things that we see here. Okay? And that's really complicated. Okay. And what we do is try to establish these boundaries, but the question is whether this is even possible. Because in the end, the issue is not specifically with the cache here, or your memory chips here, or your CPUs here. It's actually the interplay between the things that the developer creates and all of these issues around it. So in the end, this recalcitrant youth had a point. It's all just a lot of stuff. Okay. And that's another, I think, important observation. When you want to build something that is really secure, it depends not just on your code, but it depends also on everything else. And to write secure programs, I would argue, you must kind of, unfortunately, know everything else, because these abstractions are not necessarily really there. These abstractions are, in a way, could be considered harmful, right? They get in the way of you thinking about security. On the other hand, of course, they're also necessary, because we cannot know everything. And it's a dilemma. I don't have a solution to this. It's just a dilemma. But fortunately, it gets even worse. So what we do in security research, I mentioned, is try to reestablish these boundaries, but under the assumption that these are all separate concerns. So we can develop, I don't know, moving target defenses for traditional software exploitation. We can, do some limitations of the speculative execution attacks. We can partition caches. We can do all sorts of things for each of these individual classes of attack. This is what Aristotle told us to do. Okay, but unfortunately, these boundaries are only there in our heads, right? So in reality, it's all just a lot of stuff, and attackers can use whatever they want and combine any threat model of each of these classes in a new attack. So this threat model isolation in itself is problematic, because the attackers will not follow your rules. They will combine and mix and match and mess with everything. And this combination can be done in 3 different ways, at least as far as I can tell. There's 3 different ways. We can do this sequentially, concurrently, and what I would call symbiotically. And I will talk about all 3 very briefly. So sequential combination is something that we all know quite well, right? So we have an attack that starts with one thing that is being applied, and then we do something else, right? So here, for instance, we use maybe speculative execution, or in this case riddle, to break the moving target defense, address space layout randomization. Okay, and then we follow that with a traditional software, a buffer overflow or so, to create an end-to-end exploit. We do first one and then we do the other. We kind of know this. However, we can also do this concurrently. So some attacks, this is much less common, I guess, but what we can do is apply 2 different threads, and that combined solve one particular problem. For instance, in kernel randomization, we have 9 bits of randomness, so 9 bits that we have to guess as an attacker. And what we did in an attack that we published this year at EuroSNP is we used one particular vulnerability to do with the cache that we saw earlier, and the way that the memory management unit uses that cache to leak 2 of those bits. And we use a different resource, not the cache, not that cache, but rather the translation look-aside buffer, to leak the other 7 bits. And together, we now have leaked the 9 bits. So this is a concurrent application of a concurrent combination of these 2 threats. And then we combine that sequentially with, I don't know, a buffer overflow or some traditional software exploit to create an end-to-end. Okay. Now, concurrent combinations are less common than sequential combinations, but we can still relate to that, I guess. What is much more interesting, I find, and perhaps new, is this symbiotic combination. So in this case, we have 2 completely different threat models, and neither of them is effective in itself, but both of them reinforce each other. So they make each other stronger and create a combination that is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, and an interesting example of that is the blindside attack that we published at CCS in 2020, which combines speculative execution and traditional software exploitation. Okay, and I will briefly look at both and then show you how this symbiotic combination of threat models actually works. So speculative execution, as you probably all know, is an example. Spectre is an example of a speculative execution attack which made major headlines in 2008. And it works because a modern CPU is so fast that it is constantly ready to execute instructions even before it knows which instructions it should be executing. So what it does constantly is predict which instructions should be executed. So it's speculation. Okay, and it simply continues there, and if it was wrong, it will undo these instructions and start over again. Okay, but some effects of these instructions are still visible, and they can be used to leak secret information. Moreover, Spectre allows attackers to manipulate what instructions are executed. So if we see this instruction here, it's a jump to some address. The idea is that we can, as an attacker, manipulate the outcome of the predictor to make the program jump to an instruction under speculative execution that we control. Now that's bad, but fortunately nowadays we have many mitigations for these kind of speculative execution attacks. Okay, And they make the Spectre attack really difficult these days. For instance, it is difficult for the attacker to now manipulate the outcome of the predictor and then you have that used to jump to some location that the attacker would like the program to execute. And it doesn't work anymore because of, I don't know, some of the things that you see here on the slide, Petpoline and other hardware mitigations. So it's super hard. So that's Spectre. And on the other hand, we have regular traditional software exploitation, right? Buffer overflows and what have you. And they're also a little bit difficult to execute on some targets. So here, a memory error, such as a buffer overflow, allows an attacker to modify some critical data. For instance, the address that will then later be used to jump to, right? So the address of an instructions to jump to, and resume execution. Unfortunately for the attacker, like I said, this is also difficult because we have, for instance, modern moving target defenses, such as fine-grained randomization, much more complicated than coarse-grained randomization, that make it really difficult to find a suitable address to jump to. Okay. And you generally cannot afford any mistakes. For instance, if you try to attack the kernel and you make a mistake, you provide the wrong address to jump to, your machine will crash, right? It's dead. Not good. So let us see what happens if you combine these two threat models. So what we do is we're going to use a traditional memory error, so traditional software exploitation, to modify an address in memory that is subsequently used in speculative execution. Okay, so we do not manipulate the outcome of the predictor at all. So that also means that none of the Spectre mitigations work because that's what they focus on, right? So make sure that the attacker cannot manipulate the outcome of the predictor. As far as the predictor and the defenses are concerned, this address that we're now using is the real deal, even though it was really written by the attacker. So that means that we can jump to any arbitrary location in memory under speculative execution. But wait, doesn't that crash the entire machine? We saw that earlier. And the answer is no, because we're executing this speculatively. And that means that if we do things that are bad during speculative execution, well, like I said earlier, the CPU is simply going to roll that back, revert these instructions, and start over. Right? So that means that we can jump around to our heart's delight anywhere we want without any crashes. Okay. And while we're doing that, we can look for side effects of interesting code in the kernel. For instance, signatures that are left in the cache again. And in this way, we can identify all the code in the kernel of the operating system and all the data in the kernel of the operating system. And in fact, we can even look for proper Spectre gadgets that we can use. In the end, it allows the attacker to leak all possible information from the kernel. Okay. So what we see here, and that's an important slide, is that this combination, the symbiotic combination, makes memory corruption generalize the class of speculative execution attacks known as Spectre by no longer making it dependent on manipulation of the predictor outcome, no longer needed. At the same time, Spectre also generalizes traditional software attacks because now, for instance, we can just probe around, jump around without having to worry about crashes. So both generalize the other. And therefore, the combination is greater than the sum of its parts. And if you're interested in this particular kind of attack, I suggest you go and look at the URL that you see here, saw here until I had this thing. Okay, here you go. The blindside attack. It shows you how you go from a regular user, Anas in this particular case, who's the main author of this work, to a root user using this proof of concept. I think it's super interesting as an attack. Okay, to conclude, what I've shown is that I believe abstractions are actually an issue when it comes to security. So they are, as far as security is concerned, harmful. At the same time, they're also necessary. I've also argued that to write secure code, unfortunately, you kind of have to be aware of the interactions with everything else. And therefore, you need to know about all of the other stuff. Okay. I've also said that, the classification of threat models in different buckets is a problem because attackers do not feel bound by your buckets. And what I've shown is that if you combine them, you may actually get something that is much more dangerous than the individual classes of attack. And therefore, I think that the quarrelsome youth probably was right. It's all just a lot of stuff. All right, that was my presentation. I'm ready for questions if I still have time.
Herbert, thank you very much. I'm very sure that everybody has enjoyed the presentation. And if I see some of the comments in the chat, that they are confirming it. When I was listening to Michel van Eten's presentation this morning, I had an association between the title of his presentation and the very well-known Sorcerer's Apprentice, either being Mickey Mouse in Fantasia 2000 or Nicolas Cage later on. When I listened to your presentation, I start pondering, do we actually need sorcerers to be able to help us get a secure world? What does it actually mean for the competence profile of people that we educate at universities, at University of Applied Sciences, for being able to actually help develop, design, develop, deploy secure things? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, right? So what I seem to be arguing is that you can't win, right? So you need to have somebody who is sorcerer level with knowledge of all of these details. I think this is clearly a pipe dream. We will not be able to train these people. So the path that we're choosing, which is to try and reestablish these boundaries, is the best that we can do. So what we need to do in terms of training is to have people look at these issues quite carefully and constantly combine different threat models. We don't have to have a single person doing that for everything, but we need to train people to consider the interactions of different threat models and users code constantly. So this should be on the agenda, and then hopefully we'll find these issues just like what we do in our research group before, I would hope, attackers have been able to abuse these things.
Okay, thank you. A question from Etienne saying, aren't these attacks mostly a result of closed source CPU engineering like Intel and AMD do? And do you think whether how the future will look if we would use approaches like RISC-V?
Yeah, so I don't know. So part of it, it helps if things are open, right? So, but it also has a lot to do with design decisions that are not clear at the time. So even we've had in the Linux kernel, we've had bugs, security vulnerabilities that have been in there for decades, and before they were discovered. So the many eyes principle, as it's sometimes known, right? So many eyes will be able to look at this, and then surely they'll spot the vulnerabilities. It's not always working because these are very, very, very subtle issues. Okay. What I think what we're seeing is that it becomes much more difficult to find the issues as security researchers because we don't have the full insight in the hardware, for instance, and the low-level systems. And I do believe that if we are able to change this, what Gernot Heiser describes as the contract between software and hardware, such that we have more control over the low-level hardware than we currently have, the microarchitecture, if you want. That would already be a great step forward. Okay, thank you. One more question, in this case from nobody less than Michel van Eten. He said, Michel said that you said, attackers will combine threat models. And his comment is then, that's also an assumption. What evidence is there that actually do this?
Rather than speculative execution attacks, we see much more banal attacks because they work.
Yeah, so I've point taken, right? So we definitely see that attackers go for the the path of least resistance, but that they do combine different kinds of attacks, that we do see, right? So we do see that in real attacks, the randomization, for instance, is broken using other attack factors than is used in the actual vulnerability. So there is some evidence that that they are looking at combinations of different things. But I take the point that what we're looking at is more our knowledge about security rather than what is currently happening in the real world, where there may be lower hanging fruit for the attackers.
Mm-hmm. And Eras Dreyers of SIA asks, states the following: if we take the idea of symbiosis and the analogy the other way around, how can we bring together disciplined scientists, professionals in one consortium lead to a symbiosis where 1 + 1 is greater than the sum of its parts?
Yes, excellent. So I think this is one of the things that that at least the INTERSCT project, for instance, has an objective, right? So we're not just having people like me or Cristiano in this consortium. We deliberately try to connect to very different disciplines, and hopefully, link the ways in which we improve security in different disciplines to hopefully that's something that's better than what my group will ever be able to achieve on its own, or Michelle's group will ever be able to achieve on its own, or the legal groups will be able to achieve on their own.
One last question from Alexander Vassanev from TNO. How can such attacks actually be detected?
Yeah.
Except
so the last, I'm assuming that he's referring to the blind side of things. Well, so you could build specific detectors that look for this, right? So you could look at events that are unusual. In this case, there are performance counters in your CPU that you could potentially abuse or use to do some detection. In the general case, though, this is as difficult as actually solving them, right? So it's if you are able to detect them, you can stop them. Yeah. Whether or not they can be detected after they've taken place, that's another thing, right? So we don't know. We don't see anything that is necessarily corrupted.